It was supposed to be the party of the year exclusive, invite only, packed with A-list celebrities. Diddy was known for throwing legendary parties, but this time he had something special planned, something darker. Halloween was just around the corner, and he wanted to give his guests an unforgettable experience. But as he stood in the middle of his mansion's grand hall, staring at the flickering candlelight and eerie decorations, he couldn't shake an odd feeling of dread. Diddy wasn't usually one for superstitions, but something about this night felt wrong. The mansion he rented for the event was rumored to be haunted, with stories of unexplained noises and ghostly figures roaming the halls at night. His team had warned him, laughing off the tales, but Diddy felt a chill as he glanced around the dimly lit room. Still, he brushed it off. He wasn't about to let a few spooky stories ruin his night. On taps as the guests arrived, the energy in the room shifted. Everyone was dressed to impress, draped in elaborate costumes and masks. The mansion's haunting atmosphere seemed to bring out a wildness in them, and the party was in full swing within minutes. Diddy watched from the edge of the room, drink in hand, feeling strangely detached. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Then he noticed a woman across the room, staring at him intently. She was dressed in a vintage gown, her face partially obscured by a lace mask. There was something about her that felt out of place, as if she belonged to another time. Diddy raised his glass to her, but she didn't respond. She just kept staring, her eyes cold and unblinking. Shaken, he looked away, turning his attention back to the guests. But when he glanced back a few seconds later, the woman was gone. He scanned the room, searching for her, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. Uneasy, he pushed the thought aside, convincing himself it was just his imagination. After all, it was Halloween. People were playing tricks, trying to be spooky. As the night wore on, the strange occurrences multiplied. Guests reported feeling sudden cold drafts, even though the mansion was warm and packed with people. Others claimed to hear faint whispers, voices calling their names from empty corners of the room. Diddy tried to laugh it off, insisting it was all part of the Halloween vibe, but deep down, he was starting to feel unnerved. Just around midnight, the music suddenly cut out, the room fell silent, and the only sound was the crackling of the candle flames. Diddy frowned, gesturing to the DJ to fix it, but the man looked confused, frantically checking his equipment. Everything seemed to be in order, but the sound wouldn't come back on. The guests murmured, shifting uncomfortably as the atmosphere grew tense. Then, without warning, a low, haunting melody started playing from the mansion's grand piano, echoing. The guests turned, confused, as the music filled the room. No one was sitting at the piano, and yet the keys were moving, playing a slow, mournful tune that sent chills down everyone's spine. Diddy's heart raced as he watched the piano, unable to comprehend what was happening. He tried to convince himself it was some elaborate prank, something his team had set up. But as he looked around, he saw the fear in his guests' eyes. This was real, and none of them had an explanation. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. People gasped, clutching each other as a thick fog began to seep into the room, swirling around their feet. Diddy felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as the fog grew thicker, filling the hall until he could barely see the guests around him. Through the haze, he caught a glimpse of the woman from earlier, standing at the edge of the room. Her lace mask was gone, revealing hollow, lifeless eyes that stared straight at him. Her mouth twisted into a chilling smile, and she raised her hand, beckoning him to come closer. He felt a compulsion to step forward, his feet moving on their own, drawn to her by an invisible force. But just as he reached her, the fog lifted, and she disappeared once again. The guests were panicking now, some rushing for the doors, while others frantically looked around, trying to understand what was happening. Diddy tried to calm them down, but his own fear was too strong to hide. He knew something unnatural was happening in that mansion, something he couldn't control. Then he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around, but no one was there. His skin prickled as he realized that whatever was haunting the mansion had set its sights on him. The whispers grew louder, echoing his name, calling him deeper into the mansion's dark corridors. In a daze, he found himself walking down a narrow hallway away from the party. The lights dimmed as he moved further, until he was surrounded by darkness. Suddenly, the walls seemed to close in around him, twisting and warping, as if the mansion itself was alive, trapping him within its haunted embrace. He stumbled, feeling dizzy, and then he saw her again. The woman stood at the end of the hallway, her face twisted in anger. "You shouldn't have come here," she hissed, her voice echoing off the walls. Diddy tried to speak, but his voice was caught in his throat. Paralyzed by fear, the woman took a step toward him, her feet gliding across the floor as if she were floating. He backed away, but the walls closed in tighter, trapping him. Just as she reached him, the lights flickered again and she was gone. He was alone in the hallway, shaking, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, he forced himself to run back to the main hall, desperate to escape. But when he arrived, the room was empty. The guests, the music, the decorations, everything was gone, as if the party had never happened. The mansion was silent, cold, and dark, with no sign of life. Panicking, he pulled out his phone to call for help, but his screen showed no signal. He wandered through the empty mansion, calling out, but his voice only echoed back at him. After what felt like hours, he found the front door and stumbled outside, gasping for breath in the cool night air. As he looked back at the mansion, he saw a single figure standing in the window watching him. It was the woman, her face blank and expressionless. She raised her hand in a slow wave, and then the lights in the mansion went out completely, leaving him alone in the darkness. Diddy never returned to that mansion. To this day, he refuses to talk about what happened, brushing it off as a Halloween prank gone wrong. But those who were at the party know better. They remember the fog, the whispers, the haunting melody from the piano, and they know that Diddy's legendary Halloween party wasn't just unforgettable, it was haunted. Diddy had thrown countless parties, but nothing could have prepared him for the horrors of that New Year's Eve. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, the ultimate A-list event to ring in the new year. Influential celebrities, influencers, and the city's elite all gathered at his mansion, eager to party until dawn. But as the clock struck midnight, the laughter faded, and something sinister began to unfold that no one could explain. Diddy had always been a bit superstitious. Friends knew he was careful about what he invited into his life. He believed in energy, in protecting his space, and had even hired a spiritual advisor to cleanse his home before big events. But on this night, despite his preparations, something dark slipped through the cracks, something that seemed to thrive on the very excitement and chaos of the party. The night began with the usual glitz and glamour. Diddy's mansion was transformed into a wonderland of lights, music, and opulence. Champagne flowed freely, and the energy was electric. But as Diddy mingled with his guests, he couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. It was subtle at first, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, a whisper of doubt that he tried to brush off as stress. Yet the feeling only grew stronger. As the night wore on, he started noticing strange things. Shadows seemed to flicker just beyond the glow of the lights, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. Guests laughed, danced, and toasted to the new year, oblivious to the unease gnawing at him. Diddy tried to ignore it, focusing on making sure everyone was having a good time. But when he looked across the room and saw a dark figure standing in the corner, his heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, and seemed out of place amid the glitter and glow of the party. For a moment, Diddy thought it was someone in costume, maybe an eccentric guest he didn't recognize. But as he watched, the figure seemed to fade, dissolving into the shadows like smoke. He blinked, and it was gone. Shaking his head, he tried to tell himself he was imagining things. Maybe the champagne was getting to him. Midnight approached, and the energy in the room grew feverish. The DJ counted down the seconds, and everyone joined in, shouting as the clock struck 12. Cheers erupted, and people hugged, kissed, and toasted to the new year. But as the noise subsided, a chilling hush fell over the room. The lights flickered, dimming slightly, and a strange, oppressive silence took over. Diddy glanced around, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing down on him. It was as if a dark cloud had settled over the party, stifling the joy and replacing it with an unexplainable dread. He noticed some guests exchanging uneasy glances, sensing that something wasn't right. Then, out of nowhere, the music cut out. leaving the room eerily quiet. Before anyone could react, a piercing scream shattered the silence. Everyone turned, looking toward the grand staircase. A woman stood at the top, her face pale. She pointed down the stairs, but no words came out. She looked as though she'd seen a ghost, or something worse. Slowly, she backed away, trembling, as if something were approaching her, invisible to everyone else. The crowd murmured, some laughing nervously, thinking it was part of the night's entertainment. But Diddy knew better. He could feel it too, that suffocating presence filling the room. The woman at the top of the stairs suddenly turned and bolted down the hallway, vanishing into one of the guest rooms, her footsteps echoing in the silence. No one moved to follow her. The lights flickered again. Diddy's guests looked around, whispering nervously as if they were all sharing the same unspoken fear. Then a cold breeze swept through the mansion, chilling everyone to the bone. Diddy could feel it, something sinister moving among them, unseen but undeniably there. Moments later, people began to report strange things. Some felt as though they were being watched. Others claimed to see dark figures lurking just out of sight. A chill had settled over the room, and Diddy's guests, once lively and carefree, were now visibly uncomfortable, huddling together and whispering. Diddy tried to stay calm, telling himself it was all in his head, just some weird New Year's anxiety. But deep down, he knew this wasn't a coincidence. Whatever he had felt earlier that night was now stronger, feeding off the fear that was spreading through the room. One of his friends, a well-known actor, approached him, face pale. "Did you invite someone to do this?" he asked, his voice shaky. "This vibe? It feels wrong." Diddy shook his head, but he couldn't answer. He didn't know how to explain the darkness that seemed to be taking over his party, filling every corner of his home. Then another scream echoed through the mansion, this time from the hallway where the woman had fled. A group of guests ran to check, only to find her in a locked room, huddled in the corner, muttering incoherently. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she kept whispering, it's here," over and over again. Diddy's pulse raced as he ordered his security to get everyone out. His once glamorous party had turned into a nightmare, and he was done pretending everything was fine. Guests hurriedly grabbed their coats, their laughter replaced by fear, leaving the mansion as quickly as they could. But as the last guest filed out, Diddy couldn't shake the feeling that the presence hadn't left. Alone in his empty mansion, Diddy wandered through the darkened rooms, feeling the heavy, ominous silence settle around him. He checked every corner, every hallway, trying to convince himself that it was all over. But then, as he turned to leave the main room, he saw it, that same dark figure from earlier, standing in the corner, watching him. This time, the figure didn't disappear. It simply stared, unmoving, its presence filling the room with an icy dread. Diddy took a step back, his heart pounding, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at him, and a cold whisper filled his ears. "You invited me," added Diddy, stumbled backward, fear clawing at his throat. He tried to speak, to demand that it leave, but no words came out. The figure's gaze bore into him, and he felt his strength drain away, leaving him paralyzed, trapped in his own home by a darkness he couldn't understand. It was a night like any other at the recording studio. Diddy was known for pulling all-nighters, spending hours perfecting every beat, every lyric, every sound. That night, he was working alone, putting the final touches on a new track. His team had left hours ago, exhausted after a long day, but he had insisted on staying to finish just one more song. The studio was silent, save for the low hum of equipment and the occasional beat that echoed through the speakers. Around 3 a.m., Diddy leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes and stretching. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the room was pressing in on him. Shrugging it off as fatigue, he reached for his phone to check the time. That's when he noticed a missed call from an unknown number. He thought it strange. He didn't usually get calls at this hour unless it was urgent. Curious, he dialed the number back, half expecting it to go to voicemail. But to his surprise, someone picked up. There was no greeting, no hello, just silence. He waited a few seconds, then asked, "Hello, who is this?" Still silence. Just as he was about to hang up, he heard a faint whisper, The voice on the other end spoke in a low, almost raspy tone. "I've been waiting for you." Diddy felt a chill run down his spine. He'd had his share of strange encounters and fans who didn't understand boundaries, but this felt different. "Who is this?" he asked again, his voice firmer this time, but the line went dead. Shaking his head, he dismissed T as a prank. People would go to any lengths for attention, he thought, and returned to his music. As he continued working, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, he'd glance around the studio, expecting to see someone standing there, but it was always empty. Still, the sensation persisted. An hour later, his phone rang again. This time, he hesitated before answering, but curiosity got the better of him, and he picked it up. "Who is this?" he demanded, trying to mask the unease in his voice. The same raspy whisper answered, "I'm closer than you think." He felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach. "Look, whoever this is, I'm not in the mood for games," he replied, trying to sound authoritative. But the voice ignored him, continuing in a slow, deliberate tone. "You shouldn't have come back here alone, Diddy." Suddenly, the lights in the studio flickered. Diddy glanced around, his heart pounding. He knew the studio's equipment well, and flickering lights weren't a regular occurrence. His gut told him that something wasn't right, but he tried to shake it off as a power surge. He hung up, but the unease lingered, making it impossible to focus. Just as he was about to call his security team, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. The message simply read, "Turn around." Diddy's breath caught in his throat. He froze, feeling his pulse quicken. Slowly, he turned his head to look behind him. The room was empty, but the shadows seemed different. They felt darker, denser, as if something was lurking just beyond the light. He forced himself to laugh, convincing himself it was all in his mind. But then the whisper returned. This time, it wasn't coming from his phone. It was coming from right behind him. "You can't escape me." Diddy spun around, his heart racing. The studio was empty, but he could swear he felt a presence, something cold and sinister. It was as if the air itself was alive, pulsating with a dark energy. He grabbed his phone and decided it was time to leave. Whatever was going on, he wanted no part of it. As he reached for the door, he heard the voice again, echoing through the room. "I'll see you again, soon." The words hung in the air, chilling him to the core. He bolted out of the studio, leaving his equipment and everything behind, not stopping until he was outside in the fresh night air. The following morning, he returned to the studio with his team, determined to shake off the eerie experience. But when he entered the room, he stopped dead in his tracks. Scribbled on the walls, in what looked like black ash, were the words, "I warned you." His team looked at him, confused and concerned, but he brushed it off, pretending it was a prank. Inside, though, he couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond his understanding had reached out to him that night. To this day, Diddy doesn't talk about that night in the studio. Those who know him best say he's never been the same, and every now and then, in the dead of night, he'll get a call from an unknown number. He never answers it, but the strange occurrences didn't stop. Every few nights, Diddy would see that same unknown number flash on his phone screen, always around 3 a.m. He would stare at it, the eerie memory of that whisper flooding back, but he never answered. Each time, his heart would pound, his hands would shake, but he'd ignore it, convincing himself it was just a fluke, a coincidence, or maybe even someone playing a cruel prank. One night, after weeks of unanswered calls, our message was simple: "Meet me at the studio." And Diddy's stomach dropped. He felt a sense of dread, but he was also frustrated and fed up. Whatever this was, he wanted to face it, to put an end to the fear that had been haunting him. Passion against his better judgment, he grabbed his keys, got in his car, and drove to the studio. The parking lot was empty, the building dark and silent. As he entered the studio, the familiar space felt cold and foreboding. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, each one heavier than the last. When he reached the recording room, he found the lights were already on, casting an unsettling glow over the equipment. And there in the middle of the room was a small black cassette tape sitting on the console. Diddy felt a chill run through him. Cassette tapes were relics from his early days in music, a format he hadn't used in years. Hesitating, he picked it up. his fingers trembling. The label on the tape was blank, but a sticky note attached read, "Play me." He glanced around, half expecting to see someone hiding in the shadows, but he was alone. Steeling himself, he put the tape into an old cassette player, pressed play, and held his breath. A crackling static filled the room, followed by the sound of his own voice, young and raw, rapping in a way he hadn't in decades. It was a recording from his early days, one he hadn't heard in years. But then over his voice, another sound emerged, a whisper, low and sinister, weaving itself into the rhythm. "You can't escape me," it hissed, growing louder until it was drowning out his younger self's voice. Diddy's heart pounded as the whisper repeated. Over and over, the whisper became more distorted, turning into a chilling scream that filled the room, shaking him to his core. He stumbled back, pulling the tape out of the player. But the sound didn't stop. The voice echoed in his head, relentless, as if it were inside his mind. He dropped the tape, hands over his ears, but the words continued. "Warned you. I warned you." Desperate, Diddy dashed for the door, but it wouldn't open. He pounded on it, screaming for help, but the studio walls swallowed his voice. The lights began to flicker, shadows shifting around him, closing in, almost as if they were alive. He sank to the floor, his mind racing, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Then, all at once, the lights went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. A silence fell over the studio, thick and suffocating. And then in the pitch black, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder, gripping him tightly. He froze, paralyzed with fear, unable to move. The voice whispered in his ear one last time. "I'll always be here, Diddy. You can't hide from me." The grip loosened, and the presence faded, leaving him alone in the darkness. When the lights flickered back on, Diddy was huddled on the floor, gasping for breath. The door was open, and the cassette tape was gone. Stumbling out of the studio, he didn't look back, vowing never to return. He left the building behind, as well as a part of himself, forever haunted by what he'd experienced. Since that night, Diddy has never set foot in that studio again. He doesn't talk about what happened, doesn't answer unknown calls, and has developed a strange habit of avoiding mirrors at night. Those close to him say he's different now, quieter, more guarded, as if he's always listening, waiting for something or someone to return.